Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Are you, like me, confused by this new term called ping-demic? I didn't know what that was until about 45 seconds ago. Let's talk with Stacy.
Yes, we've had the ping-demic in the United Kingdom, not, of course, in the United States, because we don't do track and trace here. And this track and trace is on your cell phone. You'll be pinged if the cell phone determines that you were within a certain radius of anybody with COVID. The problem that is being caused by this is that if you were close to anybody who comes down with COVID, you have to quarantine for 10 days. So it's disrupting the whole workforce in the United Kingdom and actual goods and services being delivered. So this is official authoritative media. We're going to look at this headline from CNN, who are allowed on CNN and on YouTube, and they're allowed to be talked about regarding COVID. COVID pingdemic and Brexit mean food and gas shortages in parts of UK. A dramatic surge in COVID-19 cases is forcing hundreds of thousands of workers to stay home in Britain, causing shortages of food and gasoline and heaping stress on supply chains that were already strained by Brexit. Some of the biggest UK supermarkets warned Thursday, that's last week, that they were not able to stock some products, and gas station operators acknowledged that some of their pumps were running dry.
Right. So, no, I had not heard about this until just, within 5 minutes or so, and I had no idea. So the cell phones, of course, are tracked, in real time via satellites and other means, and everybody is therefore plugged into the grid. And if somebody is within a store that has exposed themselves to this thing, then everybody in the store has to spend 10 days in quarantine.
So the app, you have to download the app from the NHS or whatever service is providing this in the United Kingdom, and it tells you if you were close to anybody who had then come down with COVID, so that they suggest that you quarantine. Well, in fact, they kind of mandate that you, knowing that you've been pinged, you should quarantine for 10 days.
And now hundreds of thousands of people are disrupting their lives.
Yeah.
And actual supply chains are being completely disrupted.
Yes. So the point is, I guess what we're allowed to discuss on air is that, the supply shortages, because this concerns everybody. It's outside of even just COVID, is like, okay, what happens when we have supply shortages and how do we deal with this? Because this is the lifeblood of not only economies, but also just the survival, human survival, right? So everybody needs to eat, and this is being disrupted. Now, because of the pingdom, the pingdemic, they're calling it, that the law in the UK is being relaxed for anybody in the food services industry, in the agricultural industry, because there are starting to be problems with them being able to even deliver meats and necessary supplies for people to survive the week.
Right, but that sort of cuts to the efficacy of this if you have kind of a workaround in certain groups, and it kind of defeats the whole purpose. That seems very odd. And now, is the UK the only country that's having, I think pingdom, as you coined that phrase, that neologism just now, fits for a so-called kingdom. They've got the Queen's pingdom. Are they the only country doing this like this?
Well, I guess so, because they're the ones that are reopening. They've reopened as well. So places like Australia, they're completely shut down, and large parts of it, total lockdown still. The U.S., obviously, we're open, but we don't do anything like this. This is too highfalutin for us. We're not going to bother with developing an app. So 10,000 workers, however, in the food industry in the United Kingdom are exempt from this. So you're right. I mean, that's the flaw in resolving the situation or dealing with the situation, because of course we're also in a very hyper-globalized world. So even if you shut down all your borders, like Australia has done, and they're very strict there, it keeps getting in. And like one of the latest outbreaks was because of a stewardess, right? So you still have globalization. You still have people flying planes or crew on a ship having to dock and take off the goods from China. So there's always one sort of weak point, right? If you're allowing anybody in, then you should allow anybody in a way.
Right. So it's that it doesn't actually won't be effective. So, and I would imagine, just thinking, extemporaneously here, that not carrying your phone, so therefore not being pinged ready, would probably be frowned on.
On top of that, we have the headline, the debt situation. And this is, again, official Public Accounts Committee. This is part of the United Kingdom's Parliament. They've actually looked at the cost of bailing out everybody, right, to lock down. So this is, again, official, authoritative media. UK will be paying for COVID for decades, says MPs. And two new reports, the Public Accounts Committee said Number 10's response to the crisis has exposed UK taxpayers to, quote, significant financial risks. The MPs also attacked government spending on unusable protective kit. So apparently the government spent, over 10 billion pounds on PPE, personal protection equipment for hospitals and stuff, but about 2 billion pounds of it is unusable. Apparently they ordered stuff that's not actually, qualified to be used in hospitals.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what's kind of interesting here is that the country already has a debt to GDP ratio above 100%.
It's just at 99.7% according to this article.
Okay. And so that's on trend there to breach the 100% threshold and go higher. So financially speaking, that's a point of instability. And in the old days, before Brexit, because the UK was attached to the EU, they could do what other EU countries do, which is to take all their debts and dump it into this giant shadow banking system that covers the world's largest trading bloc. And you could kind of buy some time there because the ECB is printing and buying and monetizing debt by the trillions. So Christine Lagarde is literally just buying trillions and trillions of garbage debt. But now, post-Brexit, they don't have that way to wash the debts into the greater EU laundromat. And so that is going to, for the first time post-Brexit, those debts are going to start to cause a lot of pain.
Yeah, and okay, the first headline, we're talking about supply shortages of actual, life necessities that are coming down the road. Here we're talking about decades to resolve this debt. Should everything just go back to normal right now? This is on a best case scenario. And on the other hand, the social media titans, nobody's even allowed to discuss. We're just allowed to just sit here and watch docilely, to just accept whatever's happening in your name and just not ask questions. Because to ask questions is you're, basically deplatformed, demonetized, ostracized, and kicked out of the community for even questioning whether or not it was a good idea to spend 2 billion pounds on PPE. In the cross-party reports published on Sunday, the Public Accounts Committee said that the taxpayer will be exposed to, quote, significant financial risks for decades to come, with the estimated cost of the government's measures having already hit 372 billion pounds in May. The UK government debt is now over 2.2 trillion pounds, or about 99.7% of GDP, a rate not seen since the early 1960s. In June alone, debt interest cost 8.7 billion pounds. So I want to also call your attention in this article, the BBC, authoritative official media, allowed on air. So I want to show you that they show this UK public sector net debt, excluding public sector banks, which I assume are all the banks that got bailed out. So here's when Keiser Report started in 2009. The debt was just over 500 billion pounds. Now it's quadrupled to 2.2 trillion pounds in that time that we've been covering this. But this is, we're also covering in this series right now in these 2 weeks, the 50 years of fiat. So that's 50 years of fiat. It seems all riskless until it doesn't.
Yes, that's an interesting chart to have the time in which we've been on the air.
Yeah.
And of course, we broadcast into 50 countries, including the UK. And we've been making points about the dangers of debt and money printing for 13 years now. And they have fallen on deaf ears, or they've fallen on very active ears, but in a country that is not keen on sponsoring and fostering free speech.
That's right. And also to put it into context, so it went from 500 billion pounds to 2.2 trillion pounds that the public sector debt is. The pound also fell in that time. You can see the decline. It was like 170 dollars to the pound back when we started, and it's about 134 now. So that's partly contained in there. But I also want to say you could also see the difference between 50 years of fiat, the US dollar versus the pound, is that the pound, it's not so easily able to be printed without any sort of consequence. In one example of future COVID costs to the United Kingdom, the Public Accounts Committee says taxpayers could be liable for an estimated 26 billion pounds of bad loans out of a total of 92 billion pounds of loans guaranteed by the government. So that's only like just under a third of the loans are going to be bad and not be paid back. Whereas in the United States, it's something like 100% of those PPP loans they were called loans, probably just for technical reasons to get around budget requirements, but they just probably called them loans. None of them are going to be paid back. They're 100% written off. But here they have to have some of the loans be paid back.
Right, and to add to the complications here, another post-Brexit impact would be the loss of the passport rights with City of London and the rest of Europe, the rest of the world. This results in a large portion of the city, as it's known, the financial center, moving to continental Europe. So the revenues coming from really the crown jewel of the British economy post-Thatcher would have to be the city, without a question of a doubt. It's the main engine of that entire economy of the country. And now that's been severely curtailed. And then add these other complications. And I mean, the credit rating, whatever it is in the UK, I think next time Moody's and S&P get together, they're going to probably drop it by, down to triple B.
Right. Well, the article does point out that Brexit has caused a huge outflow of European workers. So from the food sector, the agricultural sector. So that is part of the problem. It's not just the lockdowns.
All right. Well, if I ran a rating agency, Max's rating agency, I would downgrade immediately British sovereign debt to junk. All right. Well, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with James Howard Kunstler of Kunstler.com. Jim, we left off our conversation. You were just getting into racketeering and how basically in the United States we've had a bit of a swap out of free markets into something which is dominated by racketeering, both in the banks, the private sector, the corporations, and it gets more insidious and ugly from there once you go down the rabbit hole. But can you follow up a little bit on that?
Well, we used to do business in America, and not all business was entirely honest, but an awful lot of it was, because at the end of the day, you had to deliver some kind of a product, and either the product worked or it didn't work. And either it made people happy or it didn't make people happy. But when you're in an economy in which you're no longer really making things for people, and there's no material object there, the temptation there is to get into ever more dishonest lines of work, because there really is no kind of honest production of anything going on. So, you have the financial industry inventing one janky financial instrument after another to pawn off on an unsuspecting public, like the Norwegian pension funds, and it's essentially a dishonest way of making money. That's the essence of racketeering. The problem gets even worse because it shows up institutionally in places that you wouldn't want it to be. And namely in the United States, in medicine and in education, two activities which you would think would be inclined to be most immune from dishonest behavior, and yet they have become some of the most dishonest activities in the country. You have the universities engaging in two kinds of racketeering: college loan racketeering and intellectual racketeering. They're defrauding and ruining financially their customers, the students, at the same time that they're selling them insane fields of study that are not real. And then, of course, you have the medical system, which is simply just bankrupting people even more than they're treating them. So it's a pretty terrible consequence of having entered into that whole universe of racketeering. You can't really tell where it's going to land, and it can land in some pretty bad places.
Right. So what you're describing there is a certain layering on top of another, more and more layers of financialization to replace the manufacturing base and to enrich Wall Street and the financiers. But people are starting to really understand that there's a huge fraud going on here, so much so that the Financial Times recently pleaded with the population, quote, "Let's all please stop calling dollars fiat money. Currencies are not memes that only have value because governments say they do," end quote. Is that just an example of projection, Jim?
I'd say it's an example of the public discussion reflecting a situation that's poorly understood. And as I understand it, we're not going to solve this set of problems probably by any means of institutional policing. It's going to solve itself emergently by working its way into some form of a collapse that's going to require us to build something back, and I hate to say build it better because it's not going to be anything like what it has been, but we're going to have to build back some kind of an armature for daily life in which we can do things like conduct business in a meaningful way, make money in an honest way, treat each other more respectfully, and go about our business of having an American civilization that actually functions in a way that people can clearly understand.
So this is a good point to segue to this notion of a social credit score is seemingly being imported from China. Jen Psaki of the White House press secretary recently basically suggested this, that if one American gets kicked off of one social media platform, they should be kicked off of all. A sort of corporate totalitarianism seems to be emerging. And we see that wrong think Americans, you talk about the need for discourse. Well, discourse is not possible if you have the wrong side of that discourse, right? Wrong think Americans are being disappeared online and then actually chased down in meat space, where mobs of angry, woke people demand that these individuals never, ever, ever be allowed to work again a day in their life, that they are excluded from the job market. And now the White House is demanding that these social medias deplatform these sort of Americans. Where do you think this goes? And obviously it doesn't aid any sort of discourse that is necessary, as you point out. Over and over on your site, kunstler.com, you catalog all the catastrophes emerging as the entropy, the entropic, backburn, afterburn. So, how do we get to the point we need? Or do you just think collapse?
No, I think as far as the social stuff is concerned, that you can't understate the number of really ticked off people who are out there now. And, the attempt to control them is to label them all as right-wing conspiracy theorists. But the fact of the matter is they're mostly not. They're mostly normal people who just don't like being jerked around. It has been an effective way of preventing them from acting. For example, even contemplating another, protest in Washington against anything. But I don't think that that's going to continue. I like to compare the current regime of Joe Biden to the Jacobins of the French Revolution, who had an extremely severe and rather insane social program, and only lasted for about 11 months in power before they were overthrown by the remnants of the French Revolution. So these Jacobin wokesters, I think, have a pretty short timeline, and I think that I wouldn't be surprised if Joe Biden and the whole enterprise went down by the fall, one way or another.
The other interesting thing is just how the media I guess it's also totalitarianism in a way, a modern version, not like the ones we saw in the 30s and 40s, but this notion that they don't seem to know their history or care about their history, or they erase their history. So when they say that January 6th the protests, the storming of the Congress, of the Capitol, like that they're saying is like the worst thing since the Civil War. And yet, again, we were talking about the 70s. You were there. New York City had 1,000 bombings in New York City alone, 1,000 bombings of federal buildings there by the Weather Underground and other left-wing, radical left-wing groups. So this is like par for the course, right, of American history.
I got to say this, though. I think the original sin of our time, 50 years later, really was the whole Russiagate thing. And until some of that is adjudicated, I don't think we're going to be able to move on because, you know, people have to be held accountable for the institutional damage that they did. And if that happens, you know, Mr. Durham is still out there like some kind of an asteroid, you know, floating around in the ether. A lot of people are convinced that he's just faded away and he's flown off beyond Pluto. He'll never be seen again. But I don't think that's possible. His post obligates him to at least report. And I would be very surprised if he's not out there composing a very complex conspiracy case against a number of people. I also think that he's had a lot to add to that just in the couple of years that he's been on board. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are some new developments and new characters drawn into the picture, you know, especially considering the way the Department of Justice behaved with the whole Hunter Biden affair and the whole question of Joe Biden's racketeering and grifting in foreign lands. So I'm convinced that something like that will happen. And I think if it doesn't happen, we're probably never going to be able to correct this institutional problem. And, you know, then we will have to see what happens with a collapse and a lot of severe disorder that's entailed by it.
Right. Well, you talk about Russiagate. Of course, it's a reference to Watergate. We talked about how during the Watergate era, there was a proactive press that was investigating fraud and misdoing, and there was a media.
The press is part of this
let me finish, Jim.
event. That's the big problem.
Yeah, and so now during this current Russiagate hoax, even if there is forthcoming a report showing the misdeeds of insiders and law officers, it's already been forgotten, and there's no press there to report on it anyway. It's already part of the, you know, I think it was Gore Vidal who referred to America as the United States of amnesia, right? We can't seem to remember, you know, 5 minutes. So this is a lost cause. This is gone, Jim. It's ancient history.
That's one possible explanation for it. I don't happen to subscribe to it. I think that it's still very much alive out there, and you can tell from the behavior a lot of the actors involved because they've slunk off into their burrows, and you know they're not being heard from, and they're keeping very quiet. So I think something's up.
Right. And finally, you know, in the last minute here, as we are about to approach this 50th anniversary, the most woke of these people, let's talk about the woke economics because, you know, people are fleeing New York and they're fleeing California, bizarrely. So, like, ironically, right? They're supposedly, like, presented in the press as the most woke and the way we want to be, but people voting with their feet are fleeing those places. Where do you see that trend going?
Well, it's a very complex trend because it has to do with the fact that our cities are overscaled and they're not going to be able to pay for themselves and wouldn't have been in any case due to really more to the economic conditions that are playing out. This has been accelerated by conditions that turned office skyscrapers from assets to liabilities because they can't run at 20% occupancy with people working from home. So that whole formula, the business formula of the great metroplex city, has been compromised by recent events. And, you know, I'm convinced that we're going to see a movement, not to the suburbs. That's only a temporary landing spot. I think we're going to see a move back to the small cities, the smaller towns, the places that are associated with food production. You know, we're also this year going to face probably a very traumatic food shortage situation. We've got a drought developing in the West and especially in California, at the same time that supply lines are breaking down with our global trading partners. And, we're already seeing inflation in food prices, but that will be aggravated by just simply a lack of supply. So people will be much more conscious of having to live in a place that can supply itself with food. So that says a lot about the regions of the country that are going to be more favorable than other regions. And, we're really looking at a much more massive demographic shift than a mere shift from the cities to the suburbs.
Right, Jim Kunstler. James Howard Kunstler of Kunstler.com, not only a great opinion piece writer, but rarely and crucially, a really excellent writer. Thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, Max and Stacy.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, James Howard Kunstler of Kunstler.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.